Welcome, welcome, Zoom audience, to the Six Bridges session, in which we will interview not one, but two fabulous authors. My name is Ann Fuller, and I am the owner of Best Association Management here in Little Rock, Arkansas. And in a former life, I was a horticulturist, which is why I think I was asked to interview these two fine authors. They're both very dynamic authors. It is my pleasure to dive into these two books, both with strong stories about old growth forests, the people and the communities that make their livelihoods from the forest industry, and the science and the information coming forth about sustainable forest practices, as well as new information on herbicide use and how it has affected people in these stories. As a quick introduction, I just want to read these little blurbs about the two authors and their books. California native Ash Davidson attended the Iowa Writers Workshop and now lives in Flagstaff, Arizona. Davidson's debut novel, Damnation Spring, is the story of Rich Gunterson, a logger obsessed with a redwood tree. He mortgages everything to buy a parcel of giant trees he aims to harvest. But his wife begins to suspect that the herbicides the logging company may be behind a troubling pattern of birth defects and miscarriages in the community. Suzanne Simard, a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, is a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. In Finding the Mother Tree, she argues that only through collaboration can we face the global challenges of the environmental crisis, global warming, and the deforestation boom we are currently living in. This event is sponsored by Rebsamen Fund. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have questions that you would like to ask the author, if you could please put them in the chat below. I will do my best to get to the questions at the end of the interview. But since we're interviewing two authors, I'm going to apologize in advance if we don't get to all your questions. Please be sure also to go to cals.org, that's CALS.org, and click on the Festival for Bookstore tab and purchase your copies. Some of them will be signed while copies last. And lastly, again, let's thank all the sponsors for the entire event, because as we know, the magic happens because of the sponsorship dollars. We really couldn't do such a great event without our sponsors. Now, I would like to present our two books that we've got. First of all, Ash Davidson, author of Damnation Spring, a novel of 10 years in the making. And so welcome, Ash. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
And then we have Suzanne Simard, author of Find the Mother Tree. Welcome, Dr. Simard.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ash, I think I'll start with you. I understand this is your first novel. It's a great first novel, by the way. Can you briefly tell the Zoom audience what drove you to write this, or where did this come from? Something in your childhood or something in your adulthood?
Yeah, my family lived in Klamath, California, which is in the far northern corner of California on the coast, just shy of the Oregon line, near the mouth of the Klamath River. So it's a temperate rainforest. It's misty. There are these chest-high ferns and water everywhere. And my family are not loggers. I don't come from logging stock the way Dr. Simard does. But I grew up, even though we moved away when I was very young, I grew up listening to my parents' stories about this place and about its people and the river and the forest. And I think because I was so young, those stories, by force of hearing them repeated over and over, they almost became a type of mythology of my childhood. And so absent a time machine, I can't get back to the late 70s when the book is set. So this was my way of transporting myself back there. And I think I knew from an early age that I wanted to write a book about herbicide contamination in that forest, because it was an issue that was very much on my parents' mind growing up, and led partially to their decision to leave. And everywhere we've ever lived, my whole family has never drunk from the tap again, because we relied on a creek behind the house for drinking water, the way many people do in the Pacific Northwest. And my parents were concerned about the runoff from that creek. So from that sort of curiosity and wanting to revisit that time came this book.
Well, thank you. Was there a time in that 10-year period when you were writing it, when you wanted to quit, or maybe you completely rewrote the plot or added new characters?
Yes to all of those questions.
Okay.
I feel like the big shame of this 10-year process is that it's not possible to collect tears in gallon jugs, because then I could visually show you. But I think that, and it did change, it changed from a first-person novel to a third-person novel. It started out as just Rich Gunderson's story, and his wife, Colleen the midwife, came later, and then their young son, Chubb, who's 5 when the book opens. And I think that it took 10 years because I'm slow, and I also had never written a novel before, and I did it the most inefficient way possible. But I think one of the benefits of taking that long with a project is that you really get to know your characters, because you spend a lot of time living with them. And it's actually been a little bit difficult after 10 years to put them on a shelf and say, okay, you live here now, I'm going to move on to the next book, because I'm very attached to them, which I realize makes me sound slightly insane since I invented them.
No, not at all. I wanted to ask you, did you know how the story was going to end when you started writing it?
I thought I did. And I was very sure about that ending. And the ending that you read in the book now is not the ending I had originally written. The ending in the book is the 6th attempt. So I guess in my case, 6 times a charm. And it was a surprise to me. And it is the issue that I get the most reader mail about, I must say. I think because after you spend 400 pages with someone, you're very attached to them and attached to what happens to them. And so I can understand the surprise from readers, because I was surprised when I got to that ending myself. And it took a while for it to settle and realize that it was the right one. But I do think it is, because if you read the book from start to finish, getting to that ending, there are a lot of elements that I think hint at the fact that it's going that direction, which my subconscious apparently knew, but I did not.
That's very interesting. Well, Dr. Simard, I was very impressed with the way you wove a very technical story about years of research about finding old growth forests with your deeply personal story. Can you briefly tell us about how you decide why or how or what prompted you to write with that kind of interwoven storytelling process?
Yeah, well, first I want to just say I can't wait to read Ash's book.
It's fabulous.
It sounds fabulous. So yay. And about redwoods, that's awesome. So in my case, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor at a university, and I've spent my whole life doing forest research and publishing my work in scientific journals and getting frustrated. I wrote about herbicides. I studied them. As in one part of my career, and then I watching the spraying of our forests and the unraveling of our forests as a result of these sort of brutish forestry practices has prompted me to start studying what the consequences were for the below ground world. And that's when I discovered that trees are connected in a society. And I'd written about this in journal articles, but it never really made it into forestry practices. Even though I tried so many ways to distribute my work and have it heard, it never gained traction in real change. How do we change? Do we really need to spray herbicides in our forests? Do we really need to clear cut? I don't think so, based on my research. And so I became frustrated. And so I thought, I need to reach people's minds, not have it filtered through scientific journals or governments or industry. It needs to go straight to people's minds so that they can make choices, and then those pressures can happen from the outside. So that was the main reason, and I wanted to write it in a way that anybody could understand it. So I wanted it to come as a storytelling story, so that the science sort of is absorbed as people read about the story of where I came from and why I did this work. That this work was done in the inland rainforest, not the coastal rainforest, but the inland rainforest, which are not that far really from where Ash is from, a little bit further north in Canada and more inland. So they're really, about my home and what I was seeing happening. And yeah, I just wanted to reach people so that they understood and could make decisions themselves instead of having it filtered through all of these layers of bureaucracy that never really got the word out.
Yeah. Well, you did a really fantastic job of weaving the technical with the personal story, making it a really impelling story. Both books do a great job of telling the story of the people that are dependent on the forestry industry for their livelihood, and about the introduction of evidence from environmental concerns that call for changes to be made. Dr. Simard, in the early days of your research that proved the interdependence of trees and the benefits of maintaining native plants and mixing these plants into the forestry practices, your findings were not accepted. Also, in fact, you were a young woman in a field in the 70s that was primarily male, and I can just imagine the pushback you got, which you described in your book, how easily it was for your coworkers to dismiss you. How were you able to maintain your enthusiasm for your research under such a hostile coworker environment and funding, being threatened with funding removal, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, the hostile thing was, it's an uneven field, right? I also had a lot of friends and supporters, but in general, right, that hostility really, getting back to my earlier point, really was what kept things down, kept things undercover. So yeah, what kept me going is that I grew up in these forests, just like Ash, right? I grew up in these inland rainforests, the cedars and the hemlocks and spruces, and this huge diversity. And these are, when we think of iconic old growth forests, these are the forests. The trees are huge. They have tall crown. They're really tall. They have big crowns. The diversity in the forest is really huge. And so I care deeply about them. And my family were like many generations of horse loggers. So I came from a logging family. I didn't horse log myself. By the time I became a forester, it was industrial logging, and my dad and uncles and grandfather and great grandfather had all sort of stopped doing that. But it was very much a part of our culture. And when I became a forester myself, it was so different. It was about industrial clear cutting, using herbicides. It was really not about working with the forest. It was like exploiting the forest. So that really ran against the grain for me. And so I studied it, and I continue to this very day to fight for these old growth forests, which, by the way, are still under a great deal of threat. They're still being managed in those ways. Our work is not done yet, and we still need to keep the profile up about what's happening in our forests.
That's really good that you've kept it up. Do you feel like your book has shifted any of the thinking in the bureaus that oversee the land management parts of British Columbia?
Well, certainly the book, when I published the book, the awareness of how forests work I feel has gone way up. This whole idea of the managed forest, of clear cutting, spraying herbicides, planting, and so on, is all based on this idea that trees are separate individuals that compete with each other. And that competition theory in ecology came from evolutionary ecology, really. Darwinian thinking that natural selection was based on competition, which is not incorrect. It's just incomplete. And the application of that evolutionary theory into ecology was sort of done without a curiosity about all the different ways that trees and plants can interact. So now we know that trees are connected below ground. They communicate with each other. They communicate through the air based on other people's work, not mine, but other researchers. So we know they're social creatures now, that they're connected, that they have ways of communicating their identity, their health, their vigor, whether they're under stress or whether they're in good shape. And now we see the forest as a social place rather than this really competitive place. And I think people's awareness has really increased about this. As far as the bureaucracy goes, the bureaucracy has not changed. It's still going to take a lot of pressure, I think, from public groups to make them fully, embrace this. And part of their reticence is that there's this huge business infrastructure based on this old way of thinking of forests as these, collection of trees that compete, the herbicide industry, the forestry industry. To make changes in those industries when there's a lot of vested interests is really hard.
Right. Well, that's a great segue into talking about the Mycorrhizal underground network, which for our listeners, if you don't know what that is, it's a series of, how would you describe it? Not fungi, but growths underground where the plants connect and communicate with each other, which leads us to the question about mother trees. And I'd like for you to touch briefly on, explain for our readers that maybe haven't read the book, what is a mother tree and what are the mycorrhizal networks?
Okay, yes. So they are fungi. And in forests, there are hundreds of species of fungi, and they kind of fall into four groups. There's pathogens, which are like parasites. There's saprotrophs, which decay material. There's endophytes, which are fungi that live inside of tree cells, the plant cells. And then there are these mycorrhizal fungi, which you can think of as helper fungi. And all of the trees and all the plants in our forest are obligate mutualists with these fungi. That means that they need the fungi to carry out their whole life cycle, to be able to grow, reproduce, and set seed and foster a next generation. They need these fungi to grow through the soil and pick up nutrients to deliver back to the plants. And in exchange, the trees provide energy or photosynthate. And so what these fungi do is that there are so many of them, right? But in a hectare or say an acre of forest, there's about 100 species of fungi in a typical forest, mycorrhizals fungi. And some of these can connect trees together. They connect trees of the same species, or different fungi can connect trees of different species together. And they form this network. It's like an internet below ground. And when we made a map of this internet, what it looked like in a Douglas fir forest, we found that the biggest, oldest trees were the most highly connected. So they were like the hubs in a wheel, where imagine the spokes being the fungi that go out and connect to others. And so these biggest, oldest trees have many points of connection with all the other trees in the forest. Some of these big old trees are connected to almost all of the other trees, like 80% or more. And it turns out through many experiments that these old trees also use these networks to nurture their young seedlings. So seeds growing on the forest floor, seedlings tap into these networks. They benefit from this huge resource uptake capacity of the network. And then the old trees actually deliver nutrients and water and carbon directly to the seedlings. And so that's what led us to calling them mother trees. And so really, they're just the biggest, oldest trees in the forest.
So there can be mother trees in Arkansas forests?
For sure. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a super old forest. It just is the biggest trees, the most highly connected trees.
Well, I know that you mentioned when you first got on the call that you're somewhat tired, but your enthusiasm for your topic is just incredible. Ash, I wanted to ask you, in your book, you do a beautiful job of portraying the stress on the community and on the families as the character Colleen, the midwife, raises the alarm about the birth defects in her community and the possible links to water pollution from clear cutting and spraying. Tell us about how you researched and developed Colleen's character.
I took 2 research trips to Klamath. My mom came with me, which ended up being really important because Klamath is still a very small community, very tight knit, even smaller now than it was in the 70s because of the contraction in the logging industry in that area. And I think that, you know, small towns have long memories and they can be difficult places to go against the grain. And they have a kind of tough love for their own and I think healthy skepticism of outsiders, which I certainly was by that point. And so my mom had been a school teacher, and we just happened to walk into a community dinner and someone recognized my mom because they'd taught together 28 years earlier. And so that opened the door, and she walked me over to her table and introduced me to a gentleman who cut a lot of old growth. And so I was able to sort of leverage that family history to be able to talk to people in the community who remember that time. And I also relied pretty heavily on a beautiful work of nonfiction called A Bitter Fog, which is about herbicide contamination, particularly 2,4,5-T in the coastal range of Oregon by a woman named Carol Van Strum. And many of the birth defects in the book are taken or inspired, I should say, by that book, because the book is fiction, but as you know, the concern about herbicides and their effects in that time period in the late 70s when the book is set, those concerns were very real. And I think one of the things that most shocked me about researching it, not being a scientist the way Dr. Simard is that I thought of this as something that was relegated to the past. And I was shocked and saddened to learn that there are still forest communities in the Pacific Northwest who continue to be sprayed and have their water sources sprayed. I was absolutely floored to learn that we use 2,4-D on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to control dandelions until the National Park Service banned it in 1980 on national park units, and that even after 2,4,5-T was banned for forestry uses, it continued to be used on rice crops and rangelands into the mid-1980s. So I learned a lot. I had not read Finding the Mother Tree by that point, but I first met Dr. Simard through The Overstory by Richard Powers, and I was so interested in the character Patricia Westford that I Googled her, and then I found Dr. Simard and her research. And so I wish I had known about your research. And I've watched your TED Talk kind of an embarrassing number of times. And I watched it again today because now I know that you're wearing that black jacket because there's a button missing on that shirt. And so I wish I had known about this research though, because it has changed. I live kind of across the street from a national forest. I walk the dog in it every day. And your research and learning about how connected and thinking of the forest as this intelligence, walking through it, I think about it completely differently. And I think I would have thought about the book differently. I don't know that it would have changed the plot or the story, but I think my own experience of the forest is so changed by your research, which I imagine is something that I share with a lot of people.
Thank you, Ash. Dr. Simard, would you like to make any follow-up comment about the continued use of these herbicides, or any thoughts or changes you've seen since the 70s?
Yeah, well, thanks. Yes, thank you for that question. And thank you, Ash, for your lovely comments on how your view of the forest has changed. It certainly has changed my view of the forest too. And of course, I grew up in these forests and always kind of saw them as connected places, but it's really cool to really see it in this research. And yeah, and I thought, and it was actually my study of of watching the British Columbia forest being sprayed as well, which we borrowed our techniques from what was going on in Oregon and California and Washington, and sort of transported that methodology up north. And that's what really got me, looking at why are we disconnecting? It felt like we were disconnecting the forest when it's a connected place. And to be honest, I agree with Ash. Like the herbicide spraying is still going on. We're not using 2,4-D or 2,4. I don't think we ever used 2,4,5-T up here, because by the time it was banned in the U.S., that's when we were starting to get going on using these chemicals. But what we do use up here is glyphosate, or also known as Roundup. And still in the north, so north of Prince George, that's kind of halfway up the province, there's still helicopter spraying forests to get rid of aspen and birches and cottonwoods and alders, and these plants are essential to the succession of forests. We're really undercutting our own forests by doing this. And the reason they're doing it, the reason foresters do it is because they think it's going to increase the growth of the conifers, because the conifers are the coveted market piece, right? They're valuable on the marketplace. And that's assuming that, that the forest is like a pie, that if you cut the pie up, that each piece will go to a tree. But what my research really shows is that pie actually expands when you add in all the other plants, because of all the things they do. They fill in different niches, they complement each other, they actually increase the availability of resources. And that's completely opposite to the thinking of the forest practitioners who are out there spraying plants to get rid of them as competitors. I could go on and on about this, but maybe I'll just let you ask another question.
Well, we've got some questions queuing up from our Zoom audience. And so first of all, there was a question about purchasing a novel and having it signed, and staff has nicely responded to say this: to ensure you get a signed copy, I would suggest that you contact Wordsworth Books directly. Call them at 501-663-9198. And I do think it's a while supplies last issue. The next question: can the authors comment on the devastation of the recent wildfires in the U.S. and Canada forest, especially with regard to mitigation measures that would be beneficial? And we'll start with you, Dr. Simard.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to continue on with my story about the aspens and birches and cottonwoods, because those plants that are considered competitors actually are like asbestos in forests when it comes to fire. They're full of water. Their leaves are full of water. They're really good at bringing water up from deep in the soil. And so they keep the whole forest moist. And when we spray them to get rid of them, we actually increase the flammability of the forest. And really, what we're finding in British Columbia, where we've had huge mega fires over the last several years, which are driven by climate change, but they're also driven by these forest practices that are increasing the vulnerability of our landscape by getting rid of the very plants that make it more of a fireproof place. And so, we also, by creating this like landscape of clear cuts full of flammable conifers that are young and they're very closely spaced without these, nice broadleaf trees that are very moist, we actually increase the rate of spread through these plantations, and they can actually create a whole new storm of smoke and more lightning that spawns more fires and more clear cuts further away, and these fires grow and grow and grow. So yeah, in a lot of ways, we're making it worse for ourselves by using these chemicals.
Ash, did you want to make any additional comment on that?
Just one sort of point of hope, I think. I live in Flagstaff, Arizona, northern Arizona, not too far from the Grand Canyon. And there's a large collaborative project here called the Forest Restoration Initiative, which is across 4 national forests in Arizona. And it's the largest forest restoration project in the United States. It seeks to thin about 2 million acres of national forest it's ponderosa pine forest mainly, and fire is a natural part of the life cycle of the forest. And of course, settlers, when they came to this country, were afraid of the natural fire cycle and so suppressed it. And as a result, the forest is completely overgrown. And so we also see these huge mega fires. And so the Forest Restoration Initiative has been really interesting because it's brought together about 24 stakeholders, everyone from what you would call the radical fringe of the environmental movement to the wood products industry to local governments and federal agencies, to try to think that a lot of people live in that wildland or that urban wildland interface, and what can we do to help our forests get closer to their natural state. And in Arizona, the answer has been sort of a combination of selective thinning of young trees so that the old trees are farther apart and can help bring those landscapes back, and prescribed burning. So there's some hope in Arizona for the fate of our forest.
Thank you, Ash. Dr. Simard, what do you think about controlled burns to help with that? That's a practice that's done here in our state by the Forestry Service, and it seems to prevent a lot of bad fires.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent practice. And restoring fire on the landscape, as Ash was talking about, is really, really important. Because as we have suppressed fires, as she mentioned, we've had fuel buildups, and that increases the risk of fire. So going in thinning or prescribing burning, or both of them together, is really helpful. And also like learning more about Indigenous burning practices, because back before settlement of North America, there was a lot of Indigenous burning across our landscapes, and they really kept the fuels down. They opened up the forests so that there could be more food plants growing up, and also to reduce the risk of fire around their communities. And so there's a lot of knowledge that's banked there about when to burn. Spring burns, for example, are really important, especially where I'm from, when it's nice and moist and the fires don't get away. And they really, when you do it in the spring, it reinvigorates that understory so that it comes up very nicely. And also burning, it kind of chars the forest floor, which releases nutrients in ways that other practices, like mechanical practices, like just thinning, don't do. And so it really does release a lot of special nutrients, and that also helps that regrowth in the spring. So yeah, it's a great practice.
Thank you. I did want to kind of jump back and talk a little bit about your writing styles, both of you. There was so much poetry in both of your books, just beautiful stories. Dr. Simard, I was just so impressed with how vulnerable you were in parts of your story, and I found myself just marking and underlining and thinking, wow, that's so well said. And I just really want to give you a big thumbs up for that. And as well as being just an incredible technical writer, you've got also this ability to write poetically. When you were growing up, were you aware that you were a good writer, or was that something you developed, that the more the poetical side, not so much the technical side?
Yeah, I always loved to write, and I developed some nice skills. I had great teachers in high school, and I remember I won this writing contest, and I thought, oh, I could be a writer. And then I went to university, and I was, my practical side was, well, I need to get a job too, and writers don't really make that much money. Probably Ash can attest to that. I don't know, or maybe you do, I don't know. But so I went into forestry, of course, following also in my family's footsteps. But I always wanted to write more freely. And as a scientist, you can't, right? It's very structured. It's very succinct. Any descriptive words, you got to get rid of those. And I felt like my skills at writing were actually declining over the years. And so I just really wanted to get out of that and just try to express myself like I could when I was in high school. So I guess I had a lot of pent up writing in me.
Well, you really did a fantastic job. And for those of you that have not read the book, I would just say it's a great read. Go out and buy it. Ash, I have to say that your book for me made me relive things in my childhood. There were so many little vignettes and stories you talked about, and I just, you really got into that inner child so well. But yet you say you moved away from there when you were 3 years old. So you must have had a lot of stored memories to come up with, or heard a lot of stories from grandparents and parents. Did you write stories when you were a child, or did you just have these things in your memory?
I didn't write stories about this, but I did write stories. I was very interested in the rainforest as a child, just sort of like obsessed with it to an unhealthy degree. And I love to read. Like I once there's a family story about me walking into a parking meter outside the public library because I had my nose in a book. And I think that, you know, as a shy, introverted child, books were just there was a great freedom in that. And we often lived in pretty rural areas, you know, on dirt roads. There often weren't a whole lot of other kids around. And so there's only so much one can play with one's own sister. And so I did spend a good deal of time reading. And I don't remember exactly at what age I sort of put together, like there is a person who in my mind was probably dead, but had written this. And it wasn't until I got to college, I think, that it actually occurred to me that there were contemporary writers alive and writing today. And it was something that you could do without being dead.
Oh, that is funny. We've got a couple more questions here from our audience. Let's see. How do your books maybe connect to Rachel Carson's A Silent Springs? What are your views on this? Either one of you? Are you familiar with A Silent Spring?
I guess I can speak first. I read Silent Spring when I think Rachel Carson wrote it in around 1960. And I read it when I was a teenager. And I loved her book. I mean, it's beautifully written. And she is a poetic writer herself. And just like you were talking about, the poignant lines, right? The sentences, the wisdom in that book really struck me. And I admired her through my whole life, I think. Like I felt like she was one of the great ecologists. You know, we tend to really revere the men ecologists in our history, like Aldo Leopold and John Muir in forests, or John Whitaker, or, you know, a lot of Johns. And here she was, you know, Rachel, who not only was she a great ecologist, she had a passion and a mission to, you know, break open this destructive practice of spraying herbicides, pesticides on rivers. And so she really made a huge difference in ecology, really. And I don't know if she gets credit for that, but she should.
Silent Spring was the first book I read when I set out to write this book. And I don't even remember how I knew about it. She's just sort of in the air. Like everyone knows that is the book that if you're interested in issues of chemical spraying, that is where you start. And I think what was so poignant for me about it was that even as a non-scientist, it was accessible to me. And I also didn't realize until after what a force that book was in legislation, in inspiring protective legislation for the environment in this country, with the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act after that book.
Dr. Simard, I wanted to ask you at what point in time you decided to step away from your kind of straight research and write this story, and how long did it take you to develop and write this story?
Yeah, you know, I've been thinking about it for quite a while. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I was frustrated with the lack of uptake of the work in forest practices, but I was also starting to see people writing about my work. Like Ash mentioned, Richard Powers, you know, developed this character based partly on me, and there's been several other books, and I thought, you know, there's a bigger story here. It's not just like the science or the characters were like just kind of the tip of the iceberg of the big story, and so I wanted to tell the whole thing, that, you know, that the questions that I asked about connection in forests came from who I was as a kid that grew up in these rainforests, who became a forester and saw us, you know, kind of picking apart our forests. And I wanted to tell it from the heart, right? That this is a real human story about a scientist who devoted their life to this, and lots of scientists do devote their lives to their work, and to also kind of dispel the mistrust of scientists as sort of something as other, that we really are people too, and we want to contribute to society, and we try to do the best work that we possibly can. And that really there shouldn't be this big, I know there's been mistrust of science in North America recently, and I just hope that we can get over that period. So, because science really is, it's very important in solving some of these big environmental issues, of course, and health issues as well, like COVID. The dealing with COVID is very much a science-driven remediation of what's going on with that. So, yeah, I wanted to get that human story out about that.
Thank you. Ash, I wanted to, lost my train of thought here. One moment. I'm getting several questions here, and a couple of them are excellent. I wanted to ask you, Ash, what is your next project? What are you going to kind of stay in the same genre? Are you going to take a rest? Are you going to go in a different direction? What is the next fantastic thing we will see? You love the characters so much. Will we see more on these characters?
I really love Rich and Colleen Gunderson, and it is like they still call to me a little bit. And if you gave me that book now and a red pen, there are a lot of things I would add and change, but I think they're going to stay on the shelf. I'm working on a second novel that's about a family of wildland firefighters.
Great. And you, Dr. Simard, what's next in your shoot?
Yeah, I've been so busy since this book has launched, but with the old growth issue as well, the clear cutting of old growth forests. But I do have a second book that I'm planning to write, and that is more about the life cycle of the forest, from the birth to the death, and how birth and death are one and the same, two sides of the same coin in the forest, that a dying tree gives life to the new trees, the seedlings, so that we understand that this is very much a cycle that we need to protect, like all the life cycles in the world. And I'm going to write it in another memoir-like narrative built against my project called the Mother Tree Project, which is it's a large project I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years with my students, where we're trying to save these old trees while still being able to take a few trees out here and there, much like my grandfather did with the selective logging. And then what the consequences of that kind of harvesting compared to clear cutting has on our global cycles, like our carbon cycle and water cycle and biodiversity. So yeah, that's for next year though.
Okay. I've never been to British Columbia, but just reading your book made me want to head right up there. It sounds very beautiful. And I hope at some point you can, I don't know if you've ever been to Arkansas, but the Ozarks are very beautiful. And we've got some great national parks and things here. We have a question. Who are you reading and admiring now? Are you reading toward a new project for pleasure or both? Either one of you can take that one.
Go for it, Ash.
I have for many years read memoirs by smoke jumpers and wildland firefighters, and so I've been reading those for research. And then I think the book that I'm most excited about will be out in April, on April 5th. I think it's called The Return of Faraz Ali by a British writer named Amina Ahmad, and it's a detective story and a war story and a love story. And it's just absolutely phenomenal. And I have an advance copy, but it'll be out in April, and I highly recommend picking it up.
Dr. Simard?
Well, mostly I read my inbox.
I can relate. I can so relate.
It's like, when am I going to have time to read? I'm reading a book, I think it's called Hacking Darwin, and it's sort of like dissecting what Darwin, how he did his studies, and the shortcomings and all the contributions that he made. It's really a fascinating book. But yeah, that's what I'm working on other than my inbox.
When I talked to you the other day on email, you mentioned you were out in the field working on something. So what is your project now you're working on?
Well, actually, I'm just on my way back home from Fairy Creek, and that's probably where I was going. Fairy Creek is on the west coast of British Columbia, on Vancouver Island, actually. And I think it's been in the news a lot lately because it's a site of major protests in British Columbia right now. There have been over 1,100 arrests of elders and students and Indigenous people who are fighting to save one of the last bits of old growth left on Vancouver Island. And so I was there doing, talking to the news and meeting with the forest defenders, meeting some of the elders and chiefs, and just trying to, give them support through the science. And the clear cutting of old growth forests, especially places like the Pacific Northwest, where these are the most rich, species rich, carbon rich forests in the world, even as rich as the Amazon, honestly, that it just makes no sense that we're still clear cutting them. And we're down actually to our last 3% of these iconic valley bottom old growth forests in British Columbia. And so just being there to support the movement, because I really feel like, with global change, we can't afford to be doing these old kind of draconian practices anymore. We need these forests standing because of their ability to absorb carbon and house all the species that make ecosystems work. So that's where I've been.
Well, I'm amazed at your ability to just keep working on these very complicated projects. And I don't know how you ever had time to write a book. I really don't.
I took a sabbatical and so it was not easy. It was like Ash. It's like you're living and breathing this thing, and you don't stop until you feel like you're comfortable with where it is. But yeah, it's an exhausting process.
Well, Ash and I were visiting a little bit about this before the call started, but she said, she's a very introverted person, and she's all of a sudden, it's like, my words, a fire hose is turned on with all these interviews she's having to do, and she's trying to get comfortable with that. But have you all been pleased with the acceptance, pleased or surprised by the acceptance of your books? Ash, you want to answer first?
Oh, I feel like I've been struck by the best kind of lightning. Like, I've just been so phenomenally fortunate. People have been so kind to me. And I think I haven't read the reviews because I think that I just have a hard time with any sort of feedback like that. But I think what I've been most touched by is to get emails from people who've read the book, who come from, our former loggers or mill workers, or remember living in that region at that time. And just the sense that they feel seen in that book. And it's a good reminder for me, because I came to the issue with a very strong view, with environmentalists on one side and loggers on the other. And in the course of speaking to people and writing the book, it really made me rethink this really sort of tidy dichotomy I constructed in my head, and made me remember that people who work in the forest also recreate in the forest. They hunt, they fish, they take their kids camping, and they love the woods. And I think that we have a tendency as a culture to blame people for the ills of their industry, as if they're somehow complicit in the destruction that's wrought, and then therefore deserve any sort of suffering that they experience as a result. And I think that I live in a house made of wood. I wrote a book that's printed on paper, and I think that we have to find a way, if we're going to continue to consume wood products, to be able to harvest sustainably. And on the other side, I've also heard from people who, protested during Redwood Summer and were active in that fight, and are grieving the fact that 4% of the original 2 million acres of redwood forest remain in that area. So I have been I feel very fortunate to be on the receiving end of a fire hose. And I have been very touched by people on both sort of sides of issues of environmental regulation, who've been willing to sort of give a book a chance, especially because I'm completely unknown. I'm not like Dr. Simard, who has decades of research and is, a lauded, like highly respected public figure. And so I've been very touched by people who, with all the choices they have for books in the world, that they're willing to take a chance on mine.
Well, I think you did a really great job of showing the balancing the story of the people that work in extractive industries with the environmental piece. It's a very, very, it makes you really look at both sides, very balanced. So I applaud you for that. Dr. Smart, have you been surprised by the acceptance of your book?
Yeah, I mean, it's been so heartening. I get a lot of emails as well. And I think what strikes me so much is that people really love their forests, right? They really care about what's going on in their forests. And I mean, just like, and what they create out of their ideas and like the emails, the art, there's all kinds of things that are spawning out of writings like what we're talking about, both of our books. Yeah, people are connected to forests. I mean, honestly, we are descendants of trees. We are all from the same genetic soup. So, that connection is a natural thing. And I think that, in reading about forests like we've written, it helps people to reconnect if they've been removed from them. It kind of gives them permission to go out there and hug a tree or sort of, question what's going on in forests around us. And yeah, and I agree with Ash about loggers and like this dichotomy. I come from a logging family. I grew up with loggers. And I think that a lot of people, they get their livelihood from it. But sometimes the industry, it's not always about the people. It's also about the business, and the business can get a little out of hand. And I think that, if we took, what all the loggers thought and all the enviros thought and the public, that there'd be a lot of confluence of their ideas and values. And we kind of get wrapped up in this sort of exploitation of our forests that's really not in our hearts. It's driven more by money. And so I think we do need to sort of separate these things out and try to unravel and understand them better.
I really loved the part of your book where you talked about them sending the logs down the sluice and hauling them with it. Was it mules and connecting them down the river? That people must have been incredibly hardy to live in that cold environment and do those things. You come from very hardy stock, apparently. But it was some beautiful imagery in that story. Did you rely on stories from your memories from your childhood or stories from your parents?
Both, I guess. The logging, my grandfather and uncles were still logging when I was a kid, so I got to see it firsthand. I was there when a lot of this was going on, but also the stories, right? My family is a French Canadian family, and so there were like lots of lively stories around the dinner table about the logging and the river drives and just amazing things that they did. Like my grandfather built that flume out of birch logs, and he talked about that. He built the water wheel that generated electricity for the loggers' houseboat, which he built, that we lived on in the summer times. So yeah, it was a combination of experience and just listening to these incredible stories.
Well, in a way, that's your old growth forest that contributed to your fabulous story. And Ash, I really loved how you wove in the Yurok character, Daniel. And I that really, for me, enriched the story, talking about the native people and developing that character. How did you research the character of Daniel?
I interviewed some Yurok tribal members in Klamath, and they were very generous with their time. And it was very important to me that the Yurok presence in the Klamath area, which is continuous, they've been there since time immemorial along that river, and their culture and identity and survival are really strongly linked to the salmon runs in that river. And in real life, Yurok and Carrick people really led the advocacy efforts to stop the spraying in that area. So it was very important to me to have that represented even in a fictional narrative. And then I was very blessed that Amy Cordalis, who's the remarkable general counsel for the Yurok tribe, read and reviewed the book and helped me understand some of the legal history and some of the finer points to make sure I had sort of all my ducks in a row. And if you're at all interested in salmon and the redwoods, there's a video on my website where you can go up the river with Amy in a boat, and she'll talk through the Yurok people's struggle to get more water in the Klamath and to prevent another fish kill like they saw in 2002. And it's an amazing sort of collaborative effort negotiating with agricultural interests. And I think one thing that really struck me about interviewing and speaking to Yurok people was, like any community, it is diverse. And there were many Yurok tribal members who were highly respected loggers and really sought after for their skills. And there were people in the tribe who were really leaders in trying to stop the spraying in that area. And it was important to me that that sort of range of experiences in all its richness be portrayed, and some recognition that no group of people is a monolith.
Well, thank you to you both, and we're about out of time. Again, I'm going to plug these books, and they're fabulous. If you haven't read them, please do. And ladies, thank you so much for your time. And I apologize if there was a question from the audience that I didn't get to, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So nice to meet you both.
Thank you.
You too, Anne.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.